Anthony Todt was supposed to be arrested for healthcare fraud. Instead, federal agents opened the door to a house that smelled like death. Inside were his wife, his 3 children, and the family dog. And the only person left alive was the husband and father, who said he loved them most. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you will understand how a case that began as a white-collar fraud arrest turned into one of the most disturbing familicide trials Florida has seen in years. You will understand why Anthony Todt first described the deaths as a kind of apocalyptic family pact, why he later told a jury that his wife was the real killer, and why jurors ultimately rejected that second story and convicted him on every single count. Anthony John Todt looked, at least from the outside, like the kind of man people trust without thinking twice. He was a physical therapist. He was married to Megan Todt, his longtime partner. They had 3 children, Alec, who was 13, Tyler, who was 11, and Zoe, who was 4. They also had a small family dog named Breezy. To neighbors, patients, relatives, and friends, they looked like a stable, active family with a good life, a close bond, and a future that still seemed open. Megan, in particular, was remembered in language that makes the brutality of this case even harder to process. Her obituary described a woman who was kind, patient, deeply health-conscious, musically gifted, and above all devoted to her children. She had been raised in Montville, Connecticut, earned a master's degree in physical therapy, and built a life that revolved around family, healthy living, and motherhood. The obituary also described Alec and Tyler as bright, artistic boys with strong interests in music, and Zoe as joyful, energetic, and full of personality. These details matter, because once a case becomes notorious, the victims can get flattened into evidence. But Megan, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe were not evidence first. They were a family first. The setting only made the contrast sharper. By late 2019, the Todts were living in Celebration, Florida, the Disney-developed town near Walt Disney World that has long been marketed as orderly, picturesque, and almost unreal in its neatness. The family had moved there from Connecticut. Anthony still traveled back and forth for work because the family's physical therapy business remained tied to Connecticut, while Florida became home base. On paper, it could be read as a family making a lifestyle move. In reality, the image was already beginning to crack. Because behind the family image was financial pressure. A lot of it. By January 2020, Anthony Todt was under federal investigation for healthcare fraud tied to his Connecticut clinics. According to an affidavit and criminal complaint unsealed in federal court, investigators believed he had submitted fraudulent claims to Medicaid and private insurers for physical therapy services that were never actually provided. Reporting based on those court documents described a man who was deeply underwater financially, while the fraud investigation closed in around him. This was not a small administrative misunderstanding. Federal investigators believed the alleged fraud had gone on for years. Local and national reporting based on the court papers described a business under severe stress, a man surrounded by debt, and a looming criminal exposure that threatened not only his freedom, but the identity he had built around being the provider, the professional, and the competent man, holding the family together. That pressure is not, by itself, proof of murder. But it is part of the atmosphere this case was living inside before anyone ever opened that front door in January. And then, over the holidays, the family went quiet. Not vacation quiet. Not, we're unplugging for a few days, quiet. Wrong quiet. The kind that starts small and then turns into dread. Relatives in Connecticut and elsewhere stopped hearing from Megan and the children. According to trial coverage, family members became concerned when communication broke down over the Christmas period and into early January. One family member requested a welfare check after not being able to reach them. Deputies responded in late December, but at that time they found no obvious signs of forced entry or immediate danger from outside the home. So they left. No one knew then what was already inside. That detail is haunting, because it means there was a stretch of time when people were trying to get help, trying to make sense of the silence, while the reality was already set. The family members they were asking about were not simply unreachable, they were dead. And Anthony was still there. By January 13, 2020, federal agents had an arrest warrant for Anthony Todt tied to the healthcare fraud investigation. Authorities went to the Celebration home to take him into custody. What happened next was the moment the case changed forever. According to the 9th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office, authorities were conducting surveillance at the home in January 2020 when they entered and discovered the entire family and their dog dead in the master bedroom. Trial coverage described body camera footage and witness testimony showing just how surreal and horrific that entry was. When agents and deputies entered the house, they were hit by decomposition. Not a hint of it. Not a suspicious smell that suggested something might be wrong. A house saturated with death. That is what investigators later described at trial. Megan Todt, the 3 children, and Breezy were found dead inside the home. The victims had been there long enough that decomposition had advanced badly. Reporting at the time said Anthony had been living in that house with their bodies for weeks. And that fact alone changes the emotional shape of the case. This was not a frantic husband calling for help after discovering a scene he could not explain. This was not a father running into the street in shock. This was a man still present in the house, alive, while his wife, his children, and the family dog lay dead inside. The medical findings made the case even worse. Trial reporting and later summaries of the medical examiner's testimony showed that toxic levels of Benadryl were found in Megan and the children. Prosecutors said Anthony had told detectives he suffocated and stabbed the children and suffocated Megan and the dog. The medical evidence, however, was complicated by the advanced decomposition. It established homicidal violence associated with diphenhydramine toxicity, but could not reconstruct every final second with perfect precision. What it did establish was that these were homicides. This family did not die in some peaceful sleep. They were killed. That nuance mattered at trial. Because the defense tried to lean into the limits of decomposition evidence. If the exact sequence of every wound could not be mapped with total certainty, then maybe, there was room to argue that Anthony's later story could still fit. But there is a major difference between uncertainty around exact mechanics and uncertainty around guilt. The decomposition blurred some edges. It did not erase the broader picture. The broader picture was homicidal violence, toxic Benadryl exposure, a house full of bodies, and Anthony Todt still standing there alive. And then there was Anthony's own mouth. Because in the early phase of the case, Anthony did not present himself to investigators as an innocent man who had discovered his family dead. He talked, and when he talked, he gave them one of the most disturbing narratives in the entire case. According to court reporting, Anthony told investigators that he and Megan had become fixated on the idea of the apocalypse and on the possibility that the family would be separated or enslaved if they stayed alive. In that first version, the killings were folded into a kind of twisted salvation narrative. He described a family decision to go together. He described Benadryl being used. He described killing the children. He described Megan's death. He described the dog's death. He talked like a man trying to explain not whether the family died, but why they all had to die before the world got worse. That matters because a detailed confession is different from a bare admission. It is one thing to say, "I did it." It is another thing to walk investigators through motive, sequence, method, and aftermath. And that is exactly why Anthony's later reversal became such a major issue. Because he did reverse. Completely. By the time the case reached trial in April 2022, Anthony Todt took the stand and told jurors something very different. He said it was Megan who killed the children. He said he came home and found them dead. He said Megan was still alive when he got there, that she then stabbed herself, and that he later took the blame because he wanted to protect her name. He also claimed he did not truly remember his confession to police. In other words, the defense theory did not merely tweak details. It moved the entire center of guilt from him to a dead woman who could no longer speak for herself. That is an enormous thing to ask a jury to believe. Not because mothers never kill their children. Tragically, sometimes they do. But because Anthony was not making that claim in a vacuum. He was making it after his own detailed statements to police, after weeks of living in the house with the bodies, after the fraud warrant, after the silence, after the deceptive appearance that the family was merely sick or away. To accept Anthony's trial story, jurors had to believe that a grieving husband who found his wife had murdered their children somehow chose not to call 911, not to run for help, not to alert anyone, but instead stayed in the home with the decomposing bodies and then falsely incriminated himself. That is a heavy lift. There was another layer to the story as well, Anthony's own childhood. Reporting during and after the case showed that Anthony's father, Robert Todt, had been convicted decades earlier after hiring a man to shoot Anthony's mother. Anthony was reportedly 4 years old when he witnessed or was present during that attack. His mother survived. His father was convicted. It is a disturbing, almost unbearable background detail, and it naturally drew public attention because of the eerie parallel. A child raised in the shadow of a hired attack, later growing up to stand accused of destroying his own family. But that history is context, not excuse. Trauma explains part of a person's landscape. It does not excuse murder. Back in court, the prosecution's argument was much more grounded and much less mystical. The state told jurors that this case was about control. That word came up repeatedly in trial coverage. Prosecutors argued Anthony wanted control over the family, control over the timing, control over the narrative, and control over what happened when the walls of his professional and financial life started closing in. Closing arguments, according to local reporting, framed the killings not as a chaotic spiritual collapse, but as a deliberate destruction carried out by a man who could not tolerate losing control. That theory fits the case more tightly than the defense version does. Because when you step back and look at the structure of what happened, it is all about managed appearances, federal fraud investigation, mounting debt, family silence explained away, welfare check concern deflected, bodies left in the home, a husband still in place, then a confession that packaged the murders as salvation, then a new story that packaged the murders as Megan's madness. Every version still kept Anthony at the center. Every version still made him the interpreter of what had happened. Every version still required everyone else to see events through him. That is why the post-crime behavior mattered so much. The state's theory was not only that Anthony killed them, it was that he tried to manage discovery afterward. Reporting from trial and from the early investigation said he remained in the residence with the bodies for weeks. He was not found wandering the streets in psychosis. He was not sitting in the driveway screaming that his family was dead. The image jurors had to reconcile was far colder than that. A man staying in the house while decomposition advanced, while the outside world still wondered whether the family was traveling, sick, or simply unreachable. Before trial, the defense did score one procedural win. One of Anthony's confessions was excluded because a judge found he had not been properly Mirandized before that first statement. But that did not dismantle the case. Other statements remained. My News 13 reported that court records showed Anthony had confessed 3 different times, and although the judge excluded the initial confession, later confessions remained in evidence. That meant jurors were still going to hear Anthony Todt in his own words describing what happened. And once that evidence came in, the defense was in real trouble. Because the jury was not just hearing a prosecutor accuse him, they were hearing Anthony Todt describe the deaths. They were seeing a defendant who later tried to explain those statements away by saying he had been confused, medicated, traumatized, suicidal, and trying to shield Megan's reputation. That is the kind of defense that can work only if the jury already sees the defendant as credible. And Anthony had a credibility problem the size of the entire case. There was also the money. Even though some aspects of the fraud investigation and financial collapse were not the core murder counts, they formed the pressure backdrop for everything. A P-based reporting on the unsealed federal complaint showed the fraud investigation involved phantom treatments billed to Medicaid and private insurers. Other reporting described significant debt and financial strain around the family. This did not automatically prove motive, but it gave jurors a credible reason to understand Anthony as a man under escalating pressure, a man whose professional life, finances, and public image were all at risk of collapsing at once. When Anthony testified, he tried to reposition himself as the most damaged person in the room. He cried. He said he loved his wife. He said he loved his children. He said he was not there when the children died. He said he found the horror rather than created it. But court reporting made clear that the prosecution kept bringing jurors back to the same core problem. Anthony's own prior descriptions, Anthony's own presence in the house, Anthony's own post-crime conduct, Anthony's own need to explain why every road in the case somehow circled back to him if he had truly done nothing. And then there was this simple emotional fact the state never really let go of. If Megan had murdered the children and then killed herself, why did Anthony stay there? Why live among the bodies? Why leave the world outside in the dark? Why not force that truth into daylight immediately? Even if every other part of his story were somehow plausible, that part remained devastating. Because innocent discovery usually produces urgency. What jurors saw here looked more like concealment. The jury began deliberating. At one point, according to Click Orlando, jurors reported difficulty reaching a verdict, and the judge gave an Allen charge, additional instructions urging them to continue deliberating and re-examine their positions. That matters because sometimes, after days of emotional testimony, juries need help pushing through the final wall of disagreement. But after those deliberations continued, the case broke one way, not two. On April 14, 2022, Anthony Todt was found guilty on all counts: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. Local coverage reported that after the verdict, Anthony said, "I maintain my innocence," and insisted he had not been there when his children died. The judge then sentenced him to life without parole. The state attorney's office later made the sentence even more explicit in its official release: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional year for animal cruelty. And then came the line that people still remember. The judge called him a destroyer of worlds. That phrase stuck because it cut straight through the legal language and named what had actually happened. This was not just a homicide case. It was the destruction of an entire household. A wife gone, 3 children gone, a family dog gone, a home turned into a sealed chamber of death, and a father who, according to the jury, had done all of it with premeditation. Anthony appealed. That appeal failed. On April 18, 2023, Florida's 6th District Court of Appeal issued a per curiam decision affirming the conviction. That matters because appeals are where some defendants at least find a crack in the process, a procedural error big enough to reopen the fight. Anthony Todt did not get that relief. The convictions stood. The life sentences stood. Legally, the state's version held. And that is where the formal criminal story ends. But it is not where the human story ends. Because what lingers in this case is not only the horror of the scene, it is the contradiction. The contradiction between the image and the reality, the contradiction between the father who talked about love and the man the jury concluded had murdered his family. The contradiction between a home, which is supposed to be the place of greatest safety, and what that house became, and the contradiction between Anthony's first explanation and his second. Salvation first, then blame shifting. It is also the kind of case that forces a difficult truth into the open. A family can look stable from the outside, while something catastrophic is building behind the walls. Friends had seen a couple. Neighbors had seen children. Patients had seen a professional. What federal investigators saw was alleged fraud. What jurors later saw was something darker. A man losing control of his finances, his lies, and the world he had built, and then asserting the most final kind of control possible over the people closest to him. And for all the courtroom arguments, all the theories, all the attempts to explain motive, the thing that should remain at the center is still Megan and the children. Megan, remembered for kindness, music, motherhood, and the way she cared for people. Alec, remembered as bright, talented, and serious about learning. Tyler, remembered as funny, energetic, and generous. Zoe, remembered as the little girl whose personality seemed too big for the room. Those are not side notes. They are the reason this case matters. Because once a defendant starts telling story after story, the danger is that he becomes the entire frame. And he should not be. This case is not important because Anthony Todt was manipulative. It is not important because the trial was dramatic. It is not important because the fraud investigation was messy. It is important because 4 human beings and 1 family dog were wiped out inside a home where they should have been safe. There is one more thing about cases like this. People always want the final clean answer to why. Not the legal answer, the emotional answer. The one that makes it all line up. And sometimes that answer never arrives in a way that satisfies anyone. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was financial collapse. Maybe it was control. Maybe it was delusion layered over shame. Maybe it was all of those things in one rotting knot. What the jury answered was not every question of motive. What the jury answered was the question that matters most in a courtroom. Who did this? And their answer was Anthony Todt. 4 times over. Plus Breezy. So if people remember this case the right way, they should remember the full arc. Federal agents came for fraud. They found a slaughtered family. A husband and father first talked about apocalypse. Then he talked about sacrifice. Then he talked about his wife as the killer. A jury listened to all of it and still came back with the same conclusion. Guilty. On every count. And the last image this case leaves behind is not a courtroom image. It is a house image, a house in celebration, a place that looked orderly from the outside, a place where a wife, 3 children, and a dog were dead inside for weeks, a place where the danger was not outside trying to get in. The danger was already home. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.